Thank you for joining us today for NCBA's webinar, Unlock Your Firm's Potential, Optimizing Production Management. I'm Nathan Wilner, NCBA's VP of Government Affairs, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar sponsored by NCBA's Diamond Industry Partner, Provana, one of our annual industry partners. For over a decade, Provana has proudly partnered with NCBA, aiding in the growth and transformation of its members. As a specialized knowledge process management company, they deliver tech-enabled services to the credit and collections, legal processing, and revenue cycle management sectors. With extensive expertise in business process management, AI, RPA, regulatory compliance, and secure data operations, Provana offers a comprehensive platform with modules for enhanced operation control and efficiency. Thank you, Provana, for your continued support of NCBA. Now for a few housekeeping items. You've all joined this webinar in listen-only mode, which means you have been muted. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording and materials will be made available to NCBA members and registered participants only. During the presentation today, you may submit questions via the question or chat box located on the lower section of your control panel. Questions will be answered as time permits, so feel free to submit those questions throughout the program. Please note that this webinar is not eligible for CLE. Visit our website at creditorsbar.org and look at the events and education section to locate upcoming programs, previous recordings, and our CLE on demand. Now for our famous legal disclaimer. We may all be attorneys, but we are not your attorneys. The information is for the use of webinar attendees only. Any distribution, reproduction, copying, or sale of this matter or the contents hereof without consent is expressly prohibited. This information is not to be construed as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure that this information is up to date as of the date of publication. The opinions expressed are the views of the authors alone and should not be attributed to any other individual or entity. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Brandon Speaks, Senior Vice President, Provana, and Ben Hodgkinson, Chief Operating Officer, Johnson Mark. And brief introductions. Brandon Speaks serves as Senior Vice President of Provana, a leading knowledge process management company specializing in tech-enabled services to the collections and legal processing sectors. With over 2 decades of experience in legal and operations management, Brandon possesses a wealth of knowledge in guiding optimization of strategy, operations, and profitability within collections industry. His expertise allows him to adeptly navigate the complexity of heavily regulated sectors, offering tailored solutions to address the unique challenges faced by stakeholders. Brandon is a sought-after speaker on pivotal industry subjects such as law firm strategy, change management, and optimizing operations, further solidifying his status as a thought leader in the field. Then we have Ben Hodgkinson with a tenure of 19 years at Johnson Mark. Ben has established a robust career in legal operations with an expertise in database automations and data analysis. Throughout his career, Ben has been instrumental in driving efficiency and innovation within the organization, specializing in database automations. He has streamlined numerous processes, significantly enhancing operational productivity, has successfully navigated multiple system integrations, and helped expand Johnson Mark into 8 states, ensuring seamless transitions and minimal disruptions. His dedication to continuous improvement and excellence has made Johnson Mark a leader in operational efficiency. So we have 2 highly qualified folks to talk about this subject. And with that, I believe we are ready to get started. Brandon, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. So to start with, when most people think about production management and optimization, what really comes to mind is your day-to-day operations and the basic, blocking and tackling of getting suits out the door, getting judgments, getting garnishments. But one of the big draws, in addition to that for most firms, are their bigger, more strategic goals. And that really can impact the day-to-day production as well. All of these examples that we have here are things that draw various different levels of resources from both production staff, management staff, and IT staff. And they're all very important things to keep in mind as people are looking at both production capacity requirements and trying to decide where you're going to try to optimize to create additional capacity. So the first one we have here is entry into new states, and Ben, I'll actually let you take this one. I know this is an experience that you guys have gone through very recently.
Yeah, whenever you go into a new state, we find it's a lot more draining than it might seem like on the onset. With that, making sure that you know how much time you have available, what resources you have available, and making sure that they're not drawing away from your other performance is one of the key things that you need to be looking into before you do that. There's always a big question out there of when do I go to a new state? Do I go to a new state when a client asks me, or should I go into a new state and then go to the client and ask them for work? Both have been successful for many firms. For us, we tend to like to go to a client first and have a client promise us the work. That gives us a deadline that helps us identify the resources that are going to be needed to meet that deadline in order for placements to start. That's not always an option. Sometimes you have to go the other way around, where you go into the state before the client comes on. In that case, it does lead to a little bit more bandwidth allocation over time. Usually there's less of a time constraint on that. But I think it's always important to know, is that your goal? Why are you looking to go into a new state? As we talk about some of these other opportunities, sometimes new states are not the best option for growth of your firm, whether it's because you might be able to get more placements just by improving your performance in a current state that you're already in for different clients. But yeah, I think entering into new states is one that you need to be very strategic in when you're going to do it and why you're going to do it, and then putting your allocating your bandwidth resources to that goal.
Yeah, and with entering new states, you really kind of hit all different elements of your firm's capacity. So you end up with management bandwidth, figuring out processes, IT bandwidth, setting up workflow and forms, and then just the people to do the work. So you really kind of impact across every dimension of your production capacity. So another thing we see happening quite frequently in the industry right now is firms acquiring other firms. And this can have different impacts depending on how you go about the acquisition. Are you, maintaining the operations of both firms? Are you keeping both platforms running or integrating the platforms? If you go through a system integration, you're either very often having to, import inventory into one, or from one system into another, make workflow changes. You potentially have two different workforces you're integrating. So that can be a big draw across many different areas. Another is client performance opportunities. This usually comes from two sources. One could be that awkward performance call where you might be losing position in a client scorecard. Or the other could be more strategic, where you may already be a leader, but improving performance can either create larger market share or the state opportunity that we touched on before. This is another one that could end up drawing, particularly from that management and more strategic group, as well as your production staff. Another area that I think is very similar in many ways is improved revenue. So looking at your current inventory and trying to figure out how do you get more out of it. This could be improving a suit rate, could be improving judgment rates. The most common one might be making investments in improving garnishment rates. Suit rates and judgment rates are often very closely dictated by client scorecards, with garnishments being a really key differentiator, and one that usually requires some upfront capital expense for assets, and then also, again, labor to get all of that work done. Any other thoughts there, Ben?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the key areas that when you look at improving your revenue is trying to learn and understand the ROI, the return on investment of whatever efforts you're going to do. So if you're buying employment information from a vendor, per dollar spent on that vendor, how much are you planning on collecting, and then what is your fee off of that collection? So not just looking at your gross collections as much as the fee to your firm that's coming in off of that. Same thing with letter campaigns. If you're doing a settlement campaign, exactly how much did you spend on those letters going out the door? Not just the postage cost or the paper cost, but employee times. If you don't have that as a pretty seamless opportunity or seamless process to get settlement letters out the door, what's your employee costs on that? And then are you tracking how many of those payers paid, or how many of those letters turned into payers that were due to the letter, not necessarily other legal efforts that were moving forward? I think a lot of that comes down to the final point there, the process efficiency and cost. Oftentimes, I think that back in the day, it was a lot easier to go in and just say, "Oh, we're underperforming. Let's go and throw some more phone calls at it." And a lot of times, your clients are going to come back and say, "Hey, we need to see more phone calls. We need to see more activity on this." But trying to understand the ROI of a phone call, maybe a phone call might be the best thing in the world for our clients if we make an additional 10,000 phone calls, because it's not costing them anything, but what's it costing you? Sometimes you have to look at that as a lost leader, where you say, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to lose money on making 10,000 phone calls, but at the same time, that's going to be enough of a difference maker to go in and improve a scorecard where placements are going to be affected on there. I think additionally in your process efficiency and cost, just looking and trying to identify which processes are the most expensive processes, and see if there are an opportunity in there to redesign those processes, either with more of an automation or a technology solution, not necessarily to eliminate the cost, but just to reduce and make it more cost effective for it.
Yeah, and in addition to improving bottom line more broadly, this is also one of the levers that can really change the ratio in that ROI. So let's say if each incremental garnishment has the cost of an asset, cost to produce the garnishment, cost to sign it, cost to follow up. There's some of those steps that you may not be able to change very much, like the cost of the asset or the attorney time or the phone call to the garnishee. But if drafting a garnishment takes 10 minutes versus 2 minutes, or could even be fully automated, or that pleading could even be fully automated, you might take that from something that doesn't make sense to something that makes sense.
Exactly.
All right, I think we can jump to the next slide here. So the next important element of production management is identifying your capacity requirements. And this is a really tricky thing for a lot of firms, partly because as placements change and things like that, the impact isn't immediate and it isn't uniform across all of your departments. So the staffing levels, not just right now, but 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, are all things that you really need to plan up front. So one of those pieces is looking at what all SOPs are required to meet the objective and what is the KPI for each. This is something that, in the outsourcing world, SOPs and KPIs are just kind of part of the ball game. It's something that a lot of firms struggle with, though. Ben, I know you guys have a very robust SOP system and KPI tracking, which also ties into some of this capacity projection. How do you guys go about doing it?
Yeah, I think that when we started getting into the outsourcing world, that's where we really started understanding the importance of having clean SOPs. And so we went in and started with those processes that we were outsourcing and making sure that they were in there, trying to find better tools to capture those, and understanding. One of the things that we quickly learned was that sometimes they need to be more detailed and sometimes less detailed. How granular you get, I think, often depends on a lot of factors, like turnover. Is it being outsourced? How quickly is someone there? Or how experienced is that? How advanced is it? Is that task that you're doing? But for us, after we got SOPs for all of our outsourced processes, we came back and said, we need to have these for all of our processes. And initially it started with all the processes in our collection system, making sure that if we have a task, there was an SOP for it. But then eventually we started finding there are other things that that aren't in the collection system, whether they were batch processes or audit things, clean desk sweeps, all of the other processes that might not be in there. Trying to make sure that we have a very clean, defined list of processes that are well named, easy to find, easy to reference, and that they're being looked at and being reviewed as changed or as frequently as necessary. But it's something that I think the first time it probably took us about a year to get everything documented, and after that it becomes a continual process where we expect every day someone should be looking at a couple SOPs, reviewing them, making sure that they're good. And more often than not, if we outsource something else, it's nice to get some fresh eyes on it. Sometimes we mix up the department responsibilities and move things over, and just getting fresh eyes on an SOP. Our partners are really good at stepping in and helping out in some operational things as they have capacity, and they like to do it by going in and just grabbing an SOP and not being trained on the process, and sit down and say and try to follow that SOP and see if it works well, and do an audit at that level, making sure that they're clean.
So then another important component is looking at, for each SOP, how long does it take a person to execute? And at what point in the process does that need to happen? So you get a batch of files in, you're going to need 10 minutes of employee time at around day 45 to draft a lawsuit, then 5 more minutes to electronically file it. Some number of days later, you need people checking for the conditions for a default and ultimately drafting a judgment. So understanding those timeline expectations and how that may be impacted by your client or your state, and how long it takes each SOP to execute is also very important in that future planning. Another important piece is looking at the ROI on the different process steps. And in some places, this may not be super important. You need to get your lawsuits out, you need to get judgments, that's kind of a given. But take the example of skip tracing, and particularly skip tracing multiple times. The ROI on your first skip attempt after failed service is probably pretty good. That return typically will diminish on the second attempt and typically diminish on the third attempt. And it's also an example of places where you may want to look at the ROI from 2 different dimensions. So the first is, how many new address locates and therefore serves are you getting for your cost of a human going in and looking for an address? And the second is, how did judgments that were obtained on the third address compared to judgments that were obtained on the first address perform from a liquidation perspective? Oftentimes, many firms will find that people who were really hard to find are also really hard to collect from post-judgment. So looking at all of those things and really dialing in what is the right workflow, when does it need to happen, and how long it will take, will help you set your staffing levels in place ahead of time, so you're not scrambling to keep up with work when it actually becomes due. The other related piece then as well is, how do you prioritize work within a budget? Many times as volume ramps up, the revenue trails it by a significant length of time. So while it's great to get more work coming in from your clients, you may have your costs increase significantly right away and your revenue not change for a while. So, looking at a budget, most firms are really kind of breaking things into 3 different categories. The first would be kind of compliance related. You're never going to not respond to a consumer complaint because you couldn't afford to staff for it. You're never going to understaff your payment posting department, right? You're going to either have the right number of people, or you're going to commit overtime or pull people in. That work's getting done. Second bucket is looking at, again, if you have to prioritize, what generates the highest ROI. And again, that gets back to looking at that ROI calculation, looking at the time going in, and where are you going to get the most success from it. And the third element is typically looking at client performance and market share. And this may be a place where you end up investing in something that may not be the best revenue decision in the short term, but can end up leading to growth in the future. An example that comes to mind might be in your collection department, where you add collectors up until the point that your last incremental collector is more or less break even, and you may not be making money on them directly, but as long as they're not losing money and it helps client performance, it may ultimately help you grow market share. Any other thoughts there, Ben?
No, I think that that's exactly right. There's a lot of processes that if the more dialed in you get and the more understanding you have of what that ROI is, the easier it is to make some of those decisions where you talk about, all right, if I'm breaking even, let's go ahead and do it. At times there are times where we've gone in and looked at a process and said, you know what, this is going to cost us money. We will lose money by skip tracing this batch or by making some more outbound phone calls or different things. But it was something where on a scorecard we were just underperforming, whether it was for our bad luck or something we did wrong or whatever it is. When we're underperforming and we said, you know what, we can't be underperforming on this batch. Let's go ahead and make an investment. How much is this investment going to cost? What's the long-term game? But you really can't make those decisions until you understand those ROIs and the cost and the expected return on those. But once you have those, it makes it a lot easier to make some of those tough strategic decisions to go and lose some money in the short term with hopes of making more in the long term.
Mm. All right, should we jump to the next slide? All right, so I know we already touched on SOPs, but we wanted to circle back and kind of do a whole slide on them as well, because particularly when it comes to production management, SOPs are really the cornerstone of a good production management system. And we wanted to talk through a little bit some of the elements of what makes not just a good SOP, but a good SOP strategy. So one of the things that, when we go meet with firms, we very frequently see is that SOPs really were born more of client audit requirements and what the auditor wants to see as opposed to being operational. And one of the things that often results from that is the SOP is really more of a process that's based around this long function as opposed to being tied to a specific, one-time task job that a user is performing. And when Ben and I were talking about that the other day, we were trying to think of how do you kind of put the right rule in place to differentiate that. And what Ben brought up was this one-to-one relationship with your task codes as being probably one of the better rules of thumb.
Yeah, I think that with that, for us, and every system is a little bit different, but for us, our tasks are, I think they're 8-letter codes that we try to give a pretty good description of them in those 8 letters that we're given. But we use that code in the naming convention of our SOPs. And so when we have an employee that goes in to work a task, they work that task by code, and they're able to use that code to go and search our SOPs and find exactly what they're doing. A lot of times people have come in and said, oh, well, no, these are a little bit different and it doesn't make sense. And when we've held strong to that line of one-to-one task to SOP standard, if we have a task that gets where the SOP is really long and it's significantly different across different states, and they say, oh, well, we need to have separate SOPs for it, great, go and create a separate task. And we can have a Utah task and an Idaho task if that's what we have to have. But we have to have that one-to-one relationship of tasks to SOPs, and it's something that we track every single week. We pull in our one-on-one meetings with our managers, and we have a report that shows, here are all of your SOPs, here are all of your tasks. Do they match one-to-one all the way down? And if not, that's something that they have to go and get cleaned up that day. But by doing that, it makes it so that things get a lot, they're tracked very well, they're not getting lost, we know they're being used, and anytime that someone needs to step in and cover for someone, they know exactly where to go, what to find, how to do it. The last thing I would add to that is trying to make sure that you have a distinction between a task and a policy. A lot of times we'll reference a policy or we'll put requirements in an SOP, but our policies are very separate from our tasks. Tasks and SOPs, they're how to get the work done. The policies are why we're doing it, what are the requirements, and how do we act, generally speaking, as a company to make sure that we're compliant with either legal or client standards.
Yeah, and that ties in really well to the, SOPs need to be operation driven, not audit driven. It's many firms' SOP documents really kind of read like a basic high level workflow and then a list of audit remediations they've had over the last several years. But really the right place to capture, that high level piece is in the policies, like you said, and the SOPs need to conform to the policies, but they need to be written at the right level of detail that a person can take that document and actually perform the work. So I think that's a really important key. I kind of jumped past the KPI piece, and I think we'll touch on this some more throughout the slides, so I'm not going to stay on it too long. But another thing is with each SOP, identifying how long it takes to perform that work, which again ties mainly back to staff performance evaluation and capacity planning. And then also that capturing that within the SOP is also a reminder that anytime you change the steps, you want to reevaluate that. Most of the time, as I was about to say, most of the time SOPs or the KPI or average handling time gets shorter as SOPs change, but it could go either way. Most of the time, if you're changing it due to improving a process, that gets shorter. Sometimes you're adding checks based on audit remediation can get longer, but making sure that that benchmark or metric is updated whenever the SOP changes is very important. And then the last piece here is embedding the QC standards within the SOP or linking the two together within your production management platform. QC is, I think, a weak spot for a lot of firms. Most firms have an internal audit function, which again is oftentimes based more on either high risk compliance or audit remediation, but having a QC process based around and embedded in that SOP to make sure that it is functioning as expected is kind of the final critical element here.
I think we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but for us, one of the main things that we've tried to do is separate the difference between internal audit and QC. Internal audit is around client requirements, legal requirements. QC is, are the SOPs working correctly? And they're different functions. Managers are responsible for the QC of their SOPs and tasks, whereas our audit department is responsible for the internal audits of compliance.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if we jump to the next slide, it'll be, oh no, it must be the one after that. It's all about QC. So we'll circle back to QC soon. So then kind of going away from, or stepping away for a minute from some of the basics of production management, we wanted to talk about the different levers you can pull to potentially optimize production. The first one here kind of links back to the KPIs we've touched on. And this is how you track employee performance and make employee scorecards. Typically, this is around a couple different elements, both production throughput, how much work are they getting done, and production quality, how good is the work. There can sometimes be some other HR related elements, but those are typically what you're looking to measure here. And again, one of the things we see at a lot of firms is, they assign out a lot of work, people are getting work done, but they don't really have a great idea how much different employees are actually contributing. So creating these scorecards to be able to measure and then using that to coach and train and incentivize employees can be one of the bigger levers that you guys can potentially pull.
Yeah, for us, this has been one of the key areas of opportunity that we've found in our management training is going to our managers and making sure that they're using scorecards that we've built. So we've gone in and tied our our average handling time to every one of our tasks. And then we can go in, we can capture every task that an employee completes in a day, multiply that by that average handling time, and then we can look at that as a sum total. And as you go and look at that scorecard and look by employee, I would love to see that all my employees were getting 8 hours of production done a day. Yet to see that anywhere close to that. It's usually a lot closer to 6 or 7 hours. 7 hours is a very high high level employee for us. But with that, especially when you have multiple employees that are doing similar jobs, it becomes a lot easier to go in and use that as a measurement and a conversation tool to go in and look at a scorecard and ask questions of, well, why are you unable to hit certain metrics, and why am I only getting 3 hours of production out of you? And to be able to break it down by, sometimes we break it down to the hour or half hour and say, oh, do you know what? In this half hour, you were only get 5 minutes of work done. It looks like you're chatting in the mornings, or you're taking longer breaks than you should be, or you really just struggle with this task and you don't understand it. Maybe it's a good opportunity for training. But those scorecards give so much more insight into what an employee is doing and how to help them improve their game. And occasionally it is a good reason to let someone go if they're not the right fit. But one thing that we've learned more than anything else is that hiring takes a lot of work and training takes even more. So if you can use those as a motivator and as an opportunity to identify training opportunities, that's where we've seen a lot of success of leveling up employees rather than just replacing them if we felt like they were underperforming.
Then another piece is continually evaluating these results, or continuing to evaluate this based on actual results. And this is particularly true if you see a number of employees doing similar work that are all underperforming. Now, there's a couple things that could be involved. It could be, you've just got a bad group and they're working together and kind of everyone has some of the same problems. It could be a deficiency in the SOP itself or in the workflows that are related to it. It could be, training gaps, or it's possible that the metric was wrong. It also can help you, and this ties into the next piece, identify places for process improvement. And, I'm just going to touch on this and then hand it over to Ben because this is really his wheelhouse, but every process a firm does could probably be improved. I've never seen one that is fully optimal and couldn't possibly get any better. However, as we talked about before, and we all know, we only have so much, management, strategic, and IT implementation bandwidth to do this. So looking at that, volume of work going into the SOP and the KPI, how long does it take to execute, or problems happening with it, can be really important to prioritizing which SOPs do you want to target to evaluate for automation or optimization.
Yeah, for us, this is really the backbone of what I try to do on a day-to-day basis. It all starts with those scorecards with the average handling time of those tasks, and being able to capture how many of those tasks are you doing. A lot of times I think that our managers might not be looking at it at a high enough level, and they'll go in and say, oh, this task might take me 12 minutes a day to do each, or 12 minutes per task to get these done. And this is just a really inefficient task. But when you go and you look at it and you say, oh, well, we're only doing 6 of them a week, okay, that might not be a great candidate. Whereas on the other hand, if you go in and you find that you have a task that's only taking 2 minutes a day, but you're doing 5,000 of them a week, there might be an opportunity to go in and look at that and say, hey, can we even knock off 30 seconds of the KPI time on this? Is there something that we can do? And so really what we do is we take the total number of widgets, as we call them, the widgets produced, multiply it by that average handling time for a total production cost of that. Sometimes we'll factor it in by level of employee if it's a process that has a higher level of employee, or oftentimes a turning time. We want to minimize the amount of time attorneys are spending on things, but we can go out and weight those and then sort that list by total production and total cost of that. And then from there, we can go in and start working down that list, looking for areas of opportunity to try to find automation. And as much as we love automation for saving time, saving resources, there's also a huge benefit of not having human error involved in that when you get into automation. And then there's sometimes automation is not the key. Sometimes if you can just go in and reduce handoffs, or if you can simplify a process just by reordering steps, you know, if you're having to go out to the court website twice, just keeping people on the same page or in the same screen and doing multiple steps at the same time instead of jumping back and forth, you can save a few seconds. And if the volume's high enough, those few seconds can really add up and save a lot of operational costs for you.
So the next bucket is a really common problem that we see with a lot of firms, and this is this issue that we'll call looping. We'll talk a little bit about exception management around it. So what I mean by looping is you end up executing the same SOP on the same account multiple times. And to give you an example of what I mean, let's say you filed a new suit and you're going out to check for the electronically filed copy and pull it back from the court site so you can send it off to your process server. And you checked multiple times and it's not there. And you know, sometimes we'll see this checking happen over and over and over again. It could be 3, 4, 5, 7 times. Now, there's a couple things that could be the root cause. So let's say, for example, you filed that suit in Sacramento County, California, and your checks were done on days 2, 4, and 6. Well, it means you had a bad SOP because there's zero chance that that clerk will accept that lawsuit until day 30, if not even worse. Now, on the other hand, let's say the document you filed was a motion for default judgment in Polk County, Iowa. They're not late on those. If you went and checked 3 times, the SOP should really say pick up the phone and call the clerk and see why that default didn't get entered. So looking for the places where you have multiple touches and looking at how you can redesign SOPs to optimize the process and then identify true exceptions so you can kind of take those accounts off the assembly line and get them into a fix it or a triage type mode is really important. And it can make, because of how many times some of the accounts get touched, it can sometimes have a really outsized impact on your overall labor cost.
Yeah, I think that one other thing that we've found to be very productive in that is oftentimes you'll have employees that, if your SOP says go back and review and see if this has happened before, they might do a quick scan of the notes but not catch and realize that it's happened a lot of times. So especially on the tasks that are prone to have multiple loops going on for us, we've implemented just multiple unique tasks. And so you might have follow up with court 1, follow up with court 2, follow up with court 3. And so when someone's working that task to follow up with the court the first time, they go out to the website, they look for it. If it's not there, instead of scheduling that same task again, they now schedule follow up with court 2. And that task has a unique SOP that says, all right, you know that this is the second time, go in, maybe give it a little bit longer, or you can look and see if something's happened. Maybe it's getting on the phone, following up with court the third time. If it's still not available, that's usually being worked by a manager and saying, all right, we've got a problem. Who's going to work this, and how are we going to get this resolved? There's obviously something that didn't work that we need to look into and figure out what's going on. And so a lot of times you can handle it in the SOP of just saying, hey, make sure that this isn't happening. Other times, if it's very prone for looping, we've found it beneficial to break it out into separate escalated tasks as it goes on.
Yeah, definitely. Can we jump to the next slide? All right, so I know we've touched on QC at a couple different points, but we just wanted to really kind of go through what a good QC platform looks like. And again, separate from QC, from internal audit, this is, or client audit, this is really about internal operational QC. So the first step, and actually kind of these first two buckets tie together, the way you typically will pick a sample size is based on the categorization of your SOPs into different buckets. And the way that we look at this is we give each SOP a rating based on both risk and complexity. And to kind of give you some examples of what I mean, if someone mislabels a piece of media, you end up wasting an attorney's time when they do their final review, but you don't really have that much risk. Whereas if somebody e-files a new suit in the wrong venue, you might have to dismiss a case and you end up with cost, potentially some, consumer risk, potentially client problems there. So it's a lot riskier. And then also we rank by complexity. So to kind of use the media example again, identifying and processing a piece of media is one pretty standard flow that's fairly short, whereas the initial review for eligibility for lawsuit is probably anywhere from a 10 to 15 step procedure with a number of decision trees, and so you're a lot more likely to have an error. So we'll usually rank each SOP as high, medium, or low on both of those parameters, and then use that to tie back to what is the appropriate sample size, with a low being around 5%, a high being around 15%, and various combinations in between. And then in addition to your minimum QC, which you establish through that kind of matrix or criteria, you can look at some other parameters, like a brand new employee probably starts out with either 100% QC level or something close to it, and then ramps down as they demonstrate proficiency. And an experienced employee who had a lot of QC findings recently may have their QC levels increased above that minimum threshold.
Yeah, for us, one other area where we've been able to go in and really leverage QC, an example of that is our mail review. So our incoming mail, we feel like that's a very high risk procedure that we're working, and we've actually implemented a double review of every piece of mail for new employees or high risk areas where we have it, where when they're working that queue, two people are going to actually get the exact same piece of mail to review. They answer the questions: what was this? What needs to happen? Is there a trial date? Entering all that information from that, and then at the end, it will actually go into a comparison of the two answers given for that same piece of mail. And if they differ, then it goes in for a third review, and we can use that as a training opportunity to say, hey, why are these different? And as scores start improving, we're able to ramp that back and say, all right, well, for this employee, we don't need someone reviewing all of theirs, but let's still have a 15% or a 20% review. And if they start failing and they start having multiple accounts with discrepancies in there, we can automatically ramp that back up to a higher QC, just to make sure that these high risk procedures are being caught earlier, because no matter how good your QC is, the sooner it is, the better it is. If you're able to catch something before it causes the issue, you're a lot better off than having to go in and do a cleanup of realizing that some employee's been doing a job wrong for the last 2 weeks and trying to identify every account that they touched incorrectly.
That timing and frequency of QC is such a critical point. And I see a lot of firms default to kind of like a 30-day sampling, so once a month to do QC on each SOP. And what we do for every single SOP for every firm we work for, I think that's over 10,000 SOPs now, we have daily sample size QC and it has to happen within 24 hours of work being completed. And that may not be possible for every firm to do on every SOP of their own. There is a lot of that is a costly, labor-intensive process to perform, but we do it for a couple of reasons. One, like Ben said, if you catch the error quickly, you may be able to prevent the impact. You filed something incorrectly, someone may be able to call the court and get them to not accept the filing. You drafted some paperwork wrong, it's going out in the mail, you may be able to stop it in the mailroom before it gets out. And not just on the impacted file, but when you find a QC finding, you're typically then looking at some other accounts done by the same person around the same time, and you might find a broader issue that again, you can prevent before there's an impact. The other piece is, from a user perspective, the closer you can put the coaching to the actual issue, the more likely you are to have a successful training result come out of that. And then the other piece we have here is, so what do you do with QC findings? And really the result, I'm sure you guys have all heard this from a end client perspective, is RCAs and action plans. What's the root cause of the problem and what's the action plan? Now, the question is, you're not going to do this for every error you find in QC, right? Someone makes a typo, you don't necessarily need an RCA and action plan. But what we do is we'll look at both frequency of the error, so how many occurred, and we'll also look for critical errors. So for every SOP, we really want to have a QC standard, because as much as we'd all like it, and as much as the banks might tell you that it's required, you can't ever have 100% perfection in any SOP. Just mistakes will happen. So what is the acceptable level of error before you have to have your management team go in and say, why did the errors happen and what can we do about it? Or what's the nature of a critical error that even for the one, you want to trigger that management process to go in and try to figure it out. Documenting that ahead of time, and again, tying that back to the SOP itself is really important, so people aren't at the time making judgment calls that may be influenced by how much work they want to do that day, what else is going on, but having it kind of set in stone of here's what triggers a formal RCA and action plan versus here's what is, an acceptable error level based on the risk of the procedure.
Yeah, I think if we can go to the next slide, I think that leads in a lot to where we really need to learn to play into our own strengths. As we've looked at it, we've kind of broken it into process management, people management, and then with that, you can, for us, I listen to all of these things and think, man, that's a lot of work to go in and do QC on all these accounts, all these tasks every day within 24 hours. Myself, I'm not a people manager. I don't do well with sitting down with someone and saying in a very kind voice, hey, you need to do this a little bit better. Let's review this. I tend to get more into the "you idiot, what were you thinking" mentality. And so one thing that we've actually done as a company, we've looked at it and said, hey, we're really good at the process management, but the people management isn't necessarily our strength. And I think that that's where someone like Provana, where they had the ability to do some outsourced of a lot of these procedures for them, they've come in and they've mastered a lot of the things that we are not good at. You look at that list of recruiting and retention, coaching and training, motivating employees, team building, HR management. That is a lot of work and a lot of effort that needs to be done. I mentioned earlier that hiring is a lot of work, but training is even more work. And that is something that Provana has mastered. And so we look to them and say, hey, will you handle our people management? And will you do our QC? Will you be doing these things? We go and we set those standards and say, hey, you know what? This is a top level, super high risk procedure that we need. And we've asked on some of our procedures, will you do 100% QC of these for the next couple of weeks? They just have to be done right. We can't have mistakes in there. And what's happened with that is now all of a sudden that frees up a lot of our managers' time to focus on the process management. So that's improving their workflows, managing their inventory, looking at the client performance, actually pulling up reports and diving into those and having our attorneys actually practicing law. It's what we've found is those are all of those things that if you go look at the Stephen Covey quadrants, those are the things that are important but not urgent. And those are the difference makers, is when we can go in and say, hey, we're going to focus on these things that we would do if we had time. When you go and leverage someone for outsourcing and using automation, that's where you find that time is by using those people. On the other hand, I know of other firms that are fantastic at people management. They are so good at coming in and recruiting and training, and they've got great training modules. They've got incredible opportunities there. And so they've gone in and found ways to hire people to come in and help with automation and maybe outsource more of the process management. But really what it is I think there's all of this QC and SOP stuff comes back to exactly what we're saying here of playing to your strengths and find out what you're good at and do that and see if you can't get some help on the things that you're not so good at. I think these are two very good categories. You might look at it as two completely separate categories, but whatever it is that you're good at, if you can focus on that and get help in supplementing the areas that you're not good at, that's where you're going to find a lot of time to get things and raise your firm to a higher level.
Yeah, definitely. I've always found that an hour spent doing something I'm strong at is going to help me a lot more than an hour spent trying to improve a weakness. And regardless of what the strength is, there's a lot of partners out there that can help firms, whether it's with the people management, on the process management, there's strategy consultants that can help. If it's, implementing process improvement, there's a number of places that can help. But, focusing on what you're good at and getting help for what's a challenge can definitely be an advantage here. All right, and I think as we touched on the IT part, I think that's our next slide if we want to jump to it. So this is a topic that we could probably talk about forever, although it looks like we've only got 5 or 6 minutes left. But leveraging technology and getting the most bang for your buck and leveraging technology in in ideal ways. And I'll actually let you start this one off, Ben. This is your strength and.
Yeah, I think that like Brandon said, this is something that we could go and spend probably do a whole series on just leveraging technology in legal collections. But I think that one of the biggest things is looking at that capacity and cost, looking at how many people do I have, what resources do I have available, and saying, all right, well, okay, I've got a single IT guy. He's probably going to spend most of his time making sure that the server's up and running, that people can connect, that they can log in, that putting out fires. Other firms, they might have a whole IT department. Other firms might go and outsource a lot of that, but understanding how much capacity you have and then looking at the opportunities that are out there and say, oh man, if we could do this, trying to identify, going back and saying, what is our ROI on these investments? Oftentimes you're going to find that ROI might be a lot higher than the cost of an additional resource. I think that a lot of times, going back to what Brandon said earlier, that getting more accounts, that is a very delayed return on increased revenue. For us, I think that we usually don't see a real revenue increase for about a year after a significant increase in volume. But I think that anytime that you're looking at adding technology as a tool, just understand what that ROI is and how to do it. For us, one of the nice things about using technology is that if we can come in and especially front end, be a front end heavy on automation and technology tools, it makes it a lot easier for us to be able to scale up quickly. If a client comes to us and asks if we can take in an additional amount of volume, yeah, great, go ahead and hand it to us, and that gives us a leeway to be able to hire and recruit and get people in and trained. If it's past that initial soup period, if we can get our demand letters automated and our scrubs automated and all of those first things automated, that gives us 30 days from the time of placements to really to get ramped up for any increase of volume. And so scalability becomes a huge benefit of being able to use technology in there. And then, like we mentioned before, obviously there's huge savings in cost and production cost that you get with technology. But for us, we've actually seen more of the savings come through the accuracy and avoiding having to do cleanups and having to go back to clients and say, oh, hey, do you know what, we added the wrong cost because someone was fat, or they thought that a filing fee was different than whatever it was, and having to go back and do cleanups and reconciliations with clients and the loss of confidence with the client. That's where we find that technology has really helped us a lot more, maybe even more so than in the saving of production costs.
And another piece to consider in technology is kind of the build versus buy question. And, you know, this is something, again, you could talk about for a while, but a couple important things to consider are, you know, what is your IT capacity, both in terms of quantity and specific skill needed for the project, you know, not just for building, but for maintenance, and how does that fit in with the other priorities? There's another piece that I think a lot of people might not think about, but, you know, we do a lot of projects for firms where we actually don't do any charge for a build or implementation, but can structure things where there's an ongoing transaction cost instead. So effectively, instead of spending a lot of money up front to realize savings, it can be structured in a way where, you know, where the total savings may not be quite as much, but the savings starts from the very first transaction. So, you know, particularly if, you know, cash flow or things like that are part of the motivating factor, you know, you can get right into the savings phase, and you can also fully eliminate the risk. Again, because there is no upfront expenditure and everything's based on actual transactions. There's only any costs associated if it works. And of course, there can be some P&L difference between showing something as a capital expense versus operational expense and all of that. But you know, again, there's a lot of partners in this industry that can help firms with how to ideally leverage technology to their benefit, both within their primary transaction system and through a lot of other partners as well. So I think we're pretty much at time. I guess we might have time for one or two quick questions if anyone has any.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions currently in the queue, and I'm sure that if folks do, they will reach out later on. But Brandon and Ben, this has been fantastic, and many thanks for sharing your time and expertise with us today. It's been incredibly informative and a lot of practical information that people can put to use immediately. So thank you so much for doing this for us. For our listeners, this webinar will be available in this week's weekly journal newsletter, as well as on our website, creditorsbar.org. Again, many thanks to our panelists for providing the valuable educational content and sharing their subject matter expertise with us. If any members are interested in getting involved in an NCBA committee, please email membership@creditorsbar.org. Many thanks to Provana for their continued support of NCBA and NCBA education. We appreciate your sponsorship and partnership. If you are viewing this live, we hope to see you at NCBA Connect in New Orleans next month. Finally, if you would please complete the brief survey following the webinar, we count on your participation to guide our programming for the future. And this concludes our event. We thank you for your continued support of NCBA. Have a great day.